Welcome to another episode of the Tapping into Life podcast. I am your spiritual life coach, Matthew B, back with another episode. This episode is so informative, all right? So I hope that each and every one of you are ready to receive the information that I'm going to share with you. Now, before we get started, remember to like, share, tell a friend, tell another friend, and tell those friends, tell five more friends, and them five more friends, tell 10 more friends. But I want you all to also subscribe to the YouTube channel. I want you all to like the Tapping into Life LLC page where you'll receive this content as well. I hope each and every one of you have had an amazing week. All right. We have made it through another week. So I speak prosperity, accomplished goals, revelations, positivity, love, happiness, kindness, joy. All of these positive things I speak that you have had in your week. Okay. I speak it that when you look back, you say, yeah, I had these things within my week. So come on in, grab a snack, grab your pad and your pens, grab your drink, get comfortable because, like I said, it's going to be very informative. And I'm going to try my best to stay within the hour time mark, give or take 5 or 10 minutes. However, if I need to do a part 2, I would just go ahead and, do a part 2. All right. So I would stop, then, do another, an introduction to part 2 and continue with this topic. So as you all can see, right below my name is the topic that we're going to be talking about today. All right. Now, I want to talk about this because there are some things that we need to know as far as dealing with the issues of this topic and the entirety of this topic, right? And so I'm going to share some information with you to give you a level head as you maneuver through this topic and as this topic pertains to your individual lives, as well as how to help someone, um, who is dealing with the topic at hand. Because unfortunately, we all say that, we all have things in common with the next person. We have things in common with these people. We have things in common with that people. But unfortunately, this topic, every last one of us on this earth has gone through and going through, healing from, assessing, working on, discovering, identifying, the effects of it. This is the thing that all of us, this is one of the things that we all have in common in this world. So we're going to get into it. I'm going to give you this information. I speak open spiritual ears that you would receive this information and not only have this information as knowledge, but apply it to your individual lives and also share this information with someone else so that you can help that person or those people maneuver through. So as you can see, the topic at hand is trauma and us. Okay. Now, I know some of y'all, Matthew, here we go again. You bring up something that requires me to do work. Listen, in order for you to be a better you, and in order for you to maximize your full potential and tap into that life that was spoken into you on day one, you're going to have to put in the work. And majority of the work, not all, but majority of the work is the topic at hand and how to maneuver through it and handle it appropriately. So, you know, sorry, but it is what it is. We all got to do it. We all got to put in the work to be great in life. So, we're going to be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about trauma. And the process of writing out all this information, before I started recording, I spent a few days writing out all this information and reading it back, and making sure I have everything that I needed. And I'm thinking, during the process, I'm like, something missing, right? Y'all know, like, when you cooking, for those who cook, and you sample what you're cooking, and you might something missing. Something missing. I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger on it. Something missing. That's how I felt when I was writing out today's episode, because I'm like, something missing. I don't know what it is, but something is missing. And so I'm reading back, I'm thinking I'm finished and ready to record yesterday. And I'm like, okay, no, wait a minute. Something ain't right, something missing. And I just so happened to be scrolling on Instagram and found a course that you can take or whatever. And so, I signed up for the course. I took the course, and the information that I was missing out of 100% of information, I had about 90%. I was missing about 10%. And after listening to these two gentlemen, really talk, I'm like, okay, now I get it. Now this is what I was missing. So let me go ahead and write this in, because this is also informative. And so when I shared this with the people, it's like, got it. I see it. So we're going to get into it. So the topic is trauma and us, right? So when we think about trauma, the definition of trauma has been changed, right? And this is my opinion. Some may agree, some may not agree, but I feel that the definition of trauma has changed. Like, it's roughly the same definition, but over time we've utilized, we've taken trauma and have utilized the very thing that trauma impacts. Well, one of the things that trauma impacts, right? So we're using our minds to come up, really, really, really dive into this definition of trauma. And when I was researching it, and when the word actually came to me, when I really, what's this trauma thing? This is years ago, but what's this trauma thing we all talking about? Like, everybody talking about trauma. You need to do this with your trauma, you need to do that with your trauma. Like, what in the world is going on? And so I'm like, okay, let me look this up. And so when I looked it up, it said, stressing or disturbing moment or experience. And I'm like, yeah, but I feel like it's more to that. And that more to that, which would highlight the true definition of it. Y'all get what I'm saying? So through research and listening to those before me who have experienced trauma, or experiencing trauma, and those before me, the pastors, the psychiatrists, the life coaches, the therapists before me, I learned that trauma is the effects of a disturbing or distressing experience. So it's not necessarily the disturbing or distressing experience, it's the effects caused by the disturbing or distressing experience. And that made more sense to me because as you go into the, as we go through the episode, we will learn that, hey, that, now I get it because it's it's the impact that trauma has on us. It's the impact and the effects that trauma has on us that would justify the definition of it being the effects of a disturbing or distressing experience. So, though trauma has a general definition, we've gotten the general definition of trauma. The question is, has trauma changed over time? Right? Has the definition of trauma, if I can correct myself, has the definition of trauma changed over time? And like I said, the general definition has not changed. It's more so of the perception that we have gathered from it. We're going by the perception of the information that we've known about this, right? So we all got to remember that trauma wasn't a big word of ours 20 years ago, right? Some people who had some family members who were in the, that just so happened or know somebody or experience going to like counseling, like therapy or psychologists or, some kind of a spiritual counseling and stuff like that. They knew about it, but the entirety, the vast majority of us, that really wasn't a big word in our vocabulary. Like we knew the word exists and we roughly knew the entirety of the definition, but we didn't know the entirety of the definition. We didn't know 100% of it. And so now we have gathered 100% of it, and we have to understand that it wasn't embedded in our minds really until the pandemic, right? We really didn't, we probably knew the definition, but we didn't feel the meaning. We didn't feel the meaning and fully understand the meaning of trauma until the pandemic. Most of us, because we were forced to be at home for X amount of time, right? Because when the pandemic happened, I'm like, okay, now wait a minute. Shoot, all I gotta do is go to work and come home. All I gotta do is go to work and come home. That's what's up. You know what I'm saying? To me, that was a moment for me to get so much accomplished and think so much about things and write so much stuff out and draw like I wanted to, But then I'm looking on the news or on my phone and I'm like, okay, these people, there are some people that, the pandemic on the mental aspect is not working out in their favors. Now, for me, it worked out in my favor mentally. For others, it didn't. And, you're listening to the therapists explain why, or you're listening to, pastors or psychiatrists or life coaches, they're explaining why. And it's like, there's so many of us that was forced to stay in one building, like the house. We were, in one room, right? In one confined space, and deal with a lot of things that we weren't prepared to deal with. And peeling back these layers, that's where your trauma was revealed. And that made it a little more detrimental because, like I said, we knew the definition. We weren't prepared to take on, the experience of the revelation of trauma. Like, we weren't ready for that. So, like I said, the definition has changed, but it was, kind of on perception. How does trauma change from one person to another? Right? Because I was researching some questions about trauma or whatever. And these are some questions that people have asked. So how does it change from one person to another? From one person to another, it's based on experience, right? So your trauma ain't my trauma, and my trauma ain't your trauma, and my trauma may not be your mama's trauma, and your trauma may not be my daddy's trauma. It changes, and even though we have some of the similar situations, it's different, right? And with trauma, how it's dealt with and how it's revealed and how it's seen and how it's handled differs from one person to the next. So one thing about trauma is that it affects differently based on one person's spirit or spiritual atmosphere and one person's humanness, right? So last week we talked about humanness and human nature and the spiritual atmosphere and how it basically works with one another. And with trauma, I'm gonna say 100% of the time, trauma is found once you start going on that journey and peeling back layers, and you find out where this trauma is as it pertains to you. It's inside of your humanness. It has embedded itself in your humanness and also your spiritual atmosphere in more ways than one. And some of us, we feel that, okay, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I wasn't born in poverty. Everything was good. I went to a good school, got good grades, went to a good college, got some degrees, never really experienced heartbreak. But for the most part, my life has been good. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, my life was like at a 9. However, if by definition, trauma is the effects of a disturbing and distressing experience, you got to understand that though your life may have been good for, up until this point, you may have had a good life, some of us. However, we have to understand that when it comes to trauma and how it affects us does not necessarily have to do with us. And we're going to get into that so we can get clarity on what I just said. So trauma alters the spiritual DNA of one's spiritual atmosphere. We have to understand that when it comes to trauma, once that trauma has taken place, it alters the genetic makeup of one's spirit. So naturally, your spirit was designed to consist of a lot of things, a lot of positive and joyful and happy and love and light kind of traits, right? But when you experience trauma, trauma alters the spiritual DNA. So now that spiritual atmosphere now feels as if though it's okay to welcome some of our toxic traits inside of our spiritual atmosphere, some of those toxic traits, and in return, our humanness is affected by that, because remember, when we're talking about humanness and spiritual atmosphere, one feeds into the other. And most of the time, your spiritual atmosphere is feeding into your humanness. But it's kind of a yin and yang. It's I feeding you, you feeding me. I feeding you, you feeding me. And whatever's being fed, that's what we're going to consume. And we're going to produce seeds based on what we consume. And so now we have this trauma that has embedded itself in our spiritual DNA. So now it's, to a certain point, tainting the spiritual atmosphere and also tainting the humanness in us. Right? So, Matthew, how does this make sense, especially with that statement that you said about, it's affecting us and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with us. It's just that that it's affecting us. Here's why, right? I'm going to break it down to you. This is where your humanness comes in. Remember, the humanness is the quality or conditions of you being a human. Something had to happen, good or bad, for you to get to this point to where you exist, right? So there had to be a series of fortunate and unfortunate events for your parents to find a way, in their story to meet each other or run across each other. And, oh, I like you, you like me, let's go on a date. Oh, this date was good, let's go on a second and third date. Let's be boyfriend, girlfriend, let's rendezvous and have a kid. And there you are, right? Everybody has a traumatic experience. However, some of these traumatic experiences are effects of traumatic effects by way of your parents. Some of us may call that generational curses. That, yes and no, but we're going to get there, right? So if your mama had a rough life, and this is an example. So if your mama had a rough life or whatever, and things did not work out in her favor as it pertained to, her childhood or whatever. And so when she got old enough, she said, look, I ain't got time to deal with the household and all this foolishness going in the household. I'm going to pack up my bags. I'm going to move to North Carolina, or I'm going to move to Georgia, or I'm going to move to Montana, right? So here your mom goes and moves away from what is traumatizing. And in return, she's living this happy life in whatever state she moved to or whatever. But she's doing that because of a traumatic experience. And so she in here, she gets a good job and this, that, and the third. Okay, well, maybe she went to the Starbucks one day because she had a little, they may have one of those pumpkin spice lattes that, a lot of us like. So she may like pumpkin spice latte. She going to the Starbucks, get a pumpkin spice latte. All of a sudden she meet this nice, fine, handsome man. And they googly-eyed over each other. And you hear, and they start, oh, I'm on my way to work, but here's my number. They talk on the phone for about a few days, for like 4 hours each day or whatever. you know, where they texting how was your day and all that googly mushy stuff. And then okay, they say, okay, well, you want to go on a date, you know, so they meet at the Cheesecake Factory. And so, you know, this nice, handsome man now knows about your mama, and your mama is asking questions about him, and then he's, you know, sharing a little bit about his life and, you know, how he got to where he is in that particular season as that particular human as it pertains to him, the individual. And the story or the humanist also consists of traumatic effects by way of his parents and their story. So it affected his humanist and his spiritual atmosphere. And now he's taking a move, you know, to be this person that he is. So now, you know, they like each other, then, you know, they fall in love with each other, and then, you know, they rendezvous, you know, for all those who know what rendezvous means. And, you know, 9 months later, there go you. Right? Your existence, your fleshly humanist existence, your humanist existence is the product of two lives that has traumatic effects intertwined in their spiritual DNA. So you're a product of two other people who experience traumatic effects or trauma. And so one may be like, okay, well, you know, Matthew, I would think that it was this fairy tale story of how my parents would have met. But, you know, but look how fairy tales start. Look how they start. And yet, if the ending is good, but look how they start. By what? Trauma. Right? A series of, you know, a series of fortunate and unfortunate events. And in those unfortunate events, those are what the trauma stems from. So what we also have to realize is that, and I'm not going to read all of this, is 3 pages worth of stuff that I wrote out. Once altered, the spiritual DNA causes the spiritual atmosphere and the humanists to change from how they were supposed to function to functioning based on the effects of the trauma. So basically, we've already covered that. All right. So the effect of trauma is projected into your human nature. Now, I don't want us to paint this picture that if our human nature is not all sunshines, rainbows, and glitter and unicorns and peaches and cream every single day, that we got some kind of a screwed up human nature. No, human nature is just that. It's human nature. It's the nature of how, you know, you as the human would carry things out based on how or what information, you know, your humanist is being fed or your spiritual atmosphere is being fed. Right? So if that's your human nature at a certain point, you know, at a certain point in your life, then that's your human nature. You know, that there's nothing that you can do about that at that moment. You know, the only thing you could do about it is identify exactly the entirety of human nature, both the good and the bad, right? So don't beat yourselves up because, you know, thinking that you know, when we talk about human nature, that, oh, we just got to assess the bad. No, no. And, you know, and I wanted to make that clear. But the human nature now has a spiritual DNA that has trauma embedded in it, right? So here's the kicker. Here's where the work comes in. Well, first I want to go and I want to another question is there trauma unseen or untreated? Right? Okay. There's a whole untreated term. We're gonna get there later, right? Because I like strongly I got strong feelings on that one. But when we're looking at is there trauma unseen? The whole example of how your parents may have met and the unfortunate events that may have taken place for them to be physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, for them to be where they were at that moment that they met. You pop out the room at a certain age, start processing memory. Then you grow up. You get potty trained, learn how to walk, learn how to talk. You got some teeth. You start daycare. You start preschool, kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th, and you keep going in life. Not once as us as humans, not once as humans have we stopped to think about the traumatic or the trauma that makes up the story of our parents meeting. Who thinks about that? Like, who thinks about that? Like, who goes to their mommy and daddy and ask, or their grandpa or grandma or their aunt and uncles, and ask, what trauma did y'all experience for y'all to meet? Like, nobody does that. However, it is trauma that is unseen because we're not knowledgeable of trauma existing. Any form of trauma that we do not know or haven't identified by the definition of trauma or how society defines trauma is unseen. We don't know it exists. We don't know it exists. That's what you call unseen trauma, because we're gathering a definition by way of our perception that has been influenced by society's definition. And let's going back to the definition, or and why I feel personally that the definition has changed, because, like I said, it's the effect of a disturbing or distressing experience. We make it out to be that actual experience. So the death of a loved one, somebody breaking up with you, divorce, someone who has been unalived, someone who went overseas and something happened with them overseas, or some kind of a torture. We think that trauma, in order for something to be traumatic, it has to be drastic. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 20, right? And this is where I have to disagree on society's definition, how we have intentionally yet unintentionally changed the definition. Because if you look at it, it's not always drastic, right? But with society, where we have changed the definition by way of our perception and how trauma has impacted us, and we're looking at our own personal experiences. And so when we look at our own personal experiences, we now discredit in return. We discredit, our human nature, our spirit, our humanness, and our human nature discredits experiences that someone else may have gone through, or discredits the trauma that someone else has gone through because it didn't pertain to them directly. This is what, unseen or silent trauma is. It's trauma not seen, because of the definition. We got to get back to the original definition, right? Unseen or silent trauma, to a certain extent, can be untreated trauma. And that's the trauma that has not been acknowledged or treated, right? So it kind of go hand in hand. You kind of got some similarities, but still has an effect that will oftentimes develop or manifest itself to the dark stuff, right? And when I say the dark stuff, the depression. Don't nobody want to feel depressed. We don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to feel depressed. Like, we don't do that, right? The anxiety. Nobody want to be feeling, their best 1 minute at 10:05 a.m. and here come 10:07 and something happened to trigger you, and now your anxiety is just getting the best of you to the point that you like, hey, I just gotta take 5 minutes, get myself together, breathe in, breathe out. You freaking out, having crazy thoughts or whatnot. You're panicking. Like, it leads to that, and it leads, oftentimes, if it's untreated, it also leads to addiction. And the variety of addictions, not just drug addiction. It could be, a sex addiction. It could be an addiction to alcohol. It could be an addiction to narcotics, and, like, it's impacting the world now, feeling abandoned. It can lead to feeling abandoned. A lot of us, and I'm going to get to that later, a lot of us do things, and if we took, and we're thinking it's normal, but if we took the time to peel back the layers, it could be the depression, the depression. It could be anxiety. It could be addiction. It could be feeling abandoned, and also anger issues. Like, a lot of us, like, nobody pops out the womb a mad baby, right? Like, nobody pops out the womb going, ah. Like, nobody does that. It has to, stem from something traumatic that has taken place in the lives of people. So part of assessing trauma or the effects of a distressing or disturbing experience, we have to understand how it affects us. How is it maneuvering itself? How is it driving us or compelling us, in this journey of life? How is that compelling our human nature for us, to think certain ways or feel certain way, not feel, but have emotions or feel certain ways, or I just lost my train of thought. But yeah. And so once human nature can be by these things, right? So the human nature, not trauma taints the human nature, but the human nature compels us to, to think certain ways or feel certain ways. And the result, the abandonment issues, the trust issues, the anger issues, the depression, the anxiety, the addiction. These are some of the things that stems from human nature planting seeds within our souls because it's tainted. You know, we have to realize once trauma has taken place, that's a spiritual infection, right? That's a spiritual infection that starts within the spirit, makes its way down to your humanness, and now your human nature is just nothing more but the bearer of the seeds that are being placed inside your soul for your soul to grow and produce its fruit. Right? So your human nature is finding joy taking these seeds and planting them in your soul. Why? Because there's a spiritual infection that is trauma. And no matter how we look at it, you know, if in our spiritual atmosphere, we have hate in our, hate in our spiritual atmosphere, that stemmed from trauma. Something had to happen in order for you to have the hate in your, to have the hate in your heart or the hate in your mind or your spirit that you do. Right? It's the same thing with jealousy. It's the same thing with depression. Anything negative that's in your spiritual atmosphere stems from trauma. But the longer these things dwell in your spiritual atmosphere, the longer the spiritual infection is in your body. Now, we all know, even with physical infections, it may lay dormant for a certain amount of time, but eventually it'll start showing symptoms. It's the same thing with a spiritual infection, right? It's the same thing with us having trauma within our spirit, and we are not identifying it. Our human nature is carrying a spiritual infection, and in spiritual infection, is now manifesting itself with the hurt, with the with the anger, with the addiction, with the violence or the anger issues. So once we get to that point, we've been infected, right? Because first we're affected by trauma. And most times, because we don't know it, like I said, it embeds in our spiritual DNA. And after a while, it's an infection. So now we really got to, dig deep inside of our soul because, spiritually speaking, our soul is our immune system, right? Our soul is our immune system. Our spirit, that's the food that the soul feeds from, right? So the spirit is feeding the soul, and so the spirit is feeding our emotions, and the spirit is feeding, our spirit is feeding our mental, and all of that feeds the soul, but it originates from our spiritual existence. So, our spiritual atmosphere, I'm sorry. So, we have to understand that when it comes down to trauma, it's a spiritual infection that our soul, which is our immune system, we got to figure out how we're going to take care of that, how we're going to eradicate that from our spiritual DNA. And you know how you do that? You put in the work, you assess, you identify, your understanding of it, you're knowledgeable of it, right? That means we got to peel back layers and deal with things that we don't want to deal with. But if it's detrimental to our soul, to our immune system, our spiritual immune system, however, and if it's feeding or beneficial to the actual spiritual infection, we got to get rid of it. We're just going to have that uncomfortable moment that we deal with it, but in the long run, it'll be worth it. So one thing, moving on, one thing that we when it comes down to trauma, we got to understand that when it comes down to trauma is often, if it's not by society's definition, if it's nothing really drastic, or like I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, if it ain't a 20, if it ain't even a 10, a lot of times our individual traumas are minimized or discredited. Now, that is very scary to me, right? I'm really concerned about how many people who have trauma or have experienced the effects of a disturbing or distressful experience, yet it has been minimized because it's not correlating with society's definition of trauma. That bothers me as a human, because when it comes down to minimizing trauma, allergies. Trauma is oftentimes downplayed to be little to no severity, right? A lot of us have our trauma minimized. I'm gonna give you a prime example, and y'all are gonna be so shocked, right? The moment where you as a kid or someone you know or you grew up with, they might be upset about something. They might go home and they're upset about something, and the parents ask, "Hey, what's wrong?" And the child says, "I got called a name today." And the parents go, "What did they call you?" "They called me fat." And the parent said, and look, I'm okay. And the parent says, "Now, don't be worrying about what everybody else say about you. Don't be worrying about what everybody else think about you. If people gonna call names, they're gonna call people names. All right? People gonna say stuff about you. Don't worry about that. Don't sweat that. Don't even worry about it." I'm just saying, that's a form of minimizing trauma. Sometimes that's a form of minimizing trauma. Here's why. Because if little Sally comes home and tells you as a parent that they got called fat, they already crying. They already upset. They already down on their luck, right? They're already feeling some type of way. They're already sad. They already are hurt. Their feelings are hurt. It's to the point that they're crying. And you as a parent responds to, "Don't worry about it. Don't sweat that. Don't worry about that. People are going to call you names. This, that, and the third." Well, duh. Obviously, people are going to call little Sally names or whatever. Okay, she knows that now. But what has happened is you've negated the severity of the traumatic experience. So just because you may not have been Sally and have gotten called names in school, or because you may have dealt with it differently, does not mean you as a parent negates the severity of or minimize the severity of her emotions or of Sally's emotions or Sally's feelings or how she's dealing with this, you know, oh, it's going to be okay. Yeah, give the child encouragement, but saying, don't sweat it. Don't worry about it. Haters gonna hate. Yeah, you're giving them motivation, but are you assessing the fact that this is a traumatic experience? And like I said, you can't necessarily blame the parents that have done that to their child, because, like I said, by definition of trauma, that does not register to trauma as the parent. So the parent is going to respond based on society's definition of trauma. Like I said, this is why we have to get back to the original definition of trauma, because once we get back to it, and once we all, as a human race, understand the original definition of trauma, we will now realize that we should have handled that differently. Because as quiet as it's kept, we've all had that moment, right? Even if we don't have kids, we've had a little brother or a little sister or a little cousin, right? Or a friend. We 8 years old telling our 8-year-old friend, don't worry about that, man. Let them hate. Don't sweat that. Don't sweat that. Because our parents imparted the society's definition of trauma in us. So we're going to, in return, in a way that, that's unintentionally negating or minimizing someone else's trauma. And I've experienced that as a kid, right? I come home, mommy such said this about me. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. You know what? I'm a handler, right? I'm a handler. I'm gonna call this person, go up to school. I'm a handler, this thing, but don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. But by society's definition, that's how my mama came across the definition of trauma at that moment. Now, has her definition of trauma changed? Has she really, acknowledged the true definition of trauma now in 2024? Yeah. But back then, because trauma wasn't discussed like it should have been, mama negated my trauma. Because like I said, naturally, if it doesn't impact us directly, then we're not going to respond to that trauma, because we can't resonate with it. We can't relate to it. So if it doesn't affect us directly, we're not going to respond to it like someone else is responding to it. So most times trauma is minimized if it doesn't correlate with the original definition. Well, not the original definition, but society's definition. So with the effect that the spiritual atmosphere and the humanist, there's a condition that now takes place. Excuse me, y'all. There's a condition that now takes place when trauma has embedded itself in your spiritual DNA, right? It now conditions the humanist as well as the spirit or your spiritual atmosphere, and in return conditions the human nature, and in return conditions the seed that's the human nature, or the fruit that the human nature is imparting in the soul, and the soul being an immune system, is impacted negatively by what it's consuming. So it in return produces fruit that ain't so fruit-like. There's some fruit that we don't want. Instead of nice, fresh, juicy, ripe fruit, we got some rotten fruit. We don't want that, right? So conditioning our humanness or our spiritual existence in its entirety, there's a condition. Now, with that condition, that allows the spiritual infection or the effect of trauma to now manifest itself. Now, project itself. It manifests itself within you. It projects itself on how you treat other people by way of your human nature and what your soul is putting out. And so things like being revengeance, Lord Jesus, revenge, revenge, right? What gets you so angry that you got to get that you're so what? Why is it that you are so angry that what somebody did or said that you got to get them back? That is a traumatic effect. The trauma had to take place somewhere in order for you to get that mad to seek vengeance. It's okay to get angry, but how you yield that anger. Because if you yield in that anger and it ain't appropriate, and you punching people in the face and cussing people out, and we need to understand why you can't control your anger, or you lack self-control as it pertains to your anger, amongst other things, but your anger to the point that you gotta get revenge. And I'm speaking from experience because there was once upon a time where I had to get revenge. Like, you got me, I'm gonna get you. You said something to me, I'm gonna say something to you. You put your hands on me, I'm gonna put my hands on you. You know what I'm saying? Like, but at some point, growth. Thank God for growth. Other ways that people, trauma impacts or affects or condition one's spiritual atmosphere, humanness, and human nature is this thing that we call toxic masculinity. I'm just gonna be real. Society's definition of a man is a projection of a vast majority of men and women, creating a definition by way of trauma infecting the mind, which in return produces a dominance of iniquity or the effect of a traumatic effect. And we're going to get into that, but perception, right? I hope we understood that, right? Toxic masculinity. If you really, if we really assess manhood or masculinity by society's definition, you're gonna find that a lot of people had trauma when they got together and came up with this unwritten rule of how a man should move about Earth. But we're not going to go down that rabbit hole because I feel myself about to dive head first into it, and we're not going to do it, right? So we're at the hour mark. So what we're going to do is we're going to end this now. We're going to come back with part 2 of the trauma and us. So stay tuned. I will be right back.